So for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Terror of Mechagodzilla, or as it was called in Japan, Mechagodzilla's Counterattack, making this the final chapter in the Shōwa era of the Godzilla franchise. And the movie is directed by returning Godzilla director Ishirō Honda, and this would mark the final time Ishirō Honda would not only direct a Godzilla movie, but direct a full-length feature in general. As for the production of this movie, producer Tomoyuki Tanaka wanted Yoshimitsu Banno, the same guy who directed Godzilla vs. Hedorah, to direct the 15th film in the Godzilla franchise. And Yoshimitsu Banno came up with a few ideas for this particular Godzilla movie. One idea would revolve around a starfish that would mutate into a giant monster after heavy exposure to pollution that would have ended up battling Godzilla, but Yoshimitsu Banno ultimately decided to scrap the idea altogether and head in a different direction. For the new project, Yoshimitsu Banno wanted to make a sequel to Godzilla vs. Hedorah in which Godzilla would have a rematch with the Smog Monster, but instead of fighting Hedorah in Japan, Godzilla and Hedorah would have their rematch in Africa this time around. However, producer Tomoyuki Tanaka was very displeased with the idea and decided to remove Yoshimitsu Banno altogether and wanted to go in a completely different direction. And so, Toho held a contest to see who would come up with the story for the Godzilla movie this time around, with Ishirō Honda directing the movie, which would result in a first draft of Terror of Mechagodzilla that would have featured two new monsters in the form of a male and female pair of dragon-like plesiosaurs, simply referred to as Titans, that had the ability to combine together to form a new monster, simply referred to as Titan. However, due to budgetary reasons, the producers decided to remove the two Titans altogether, but kept their combined form that would eventually result in the creation of the new monster Titanosaurus, ultimately resulting in the movie that we're about to talk about today. And when Terror of Mechagodzilla hit theaters, at the time of the movie's release, it was the lowest grossing movie of the entire Godzilla franchise for a long time, until 2018's Godzilla City on the Edge of Battle, but I'm getting way ahead of myself. And the reasons as to why Terror of Mechagodzilla would result in becoming one of the lowest grossing movies of the entire franchise had to do with one of two reasons. The first reason being that the general movie-going audience around that time period had lost their interest in Godzilla as a character. Reason number two, supposedly the Japanese economy at the time was in a really bad place, resulting in Toho Studios to put the production of any new monster movies on hold, giving Godzilla, both the character and the franchise, a much needed break, with the hopes that Toho Studios can revisit Godzilla sometime later. And since then, the movie has gone on to become one of the more popular installments of the Godzilla franchise, with some people saying it's one of the better installments. And growing up, Terror of Mechagodzilla is one of the few Godzilla movies I remember renting from my local video store, which is an important detail that I'll talk about later. But anywho, with this movie serving as the final installment of the Shōwa era of the Godzilla franchise, was Terror of Mechagodzilla a good way for this particular continuity of Godzilla films to go out on? As for the plot of the movie, set a couple days after the events of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, the Interpol organization sends out a submarine to retrieve the shrapnel that used to be Mechagodzilla. Upon their search, they soon discover that Mechagodzilla's remains are nowhere to be seen, and end up getting attacked by a new sea monster called Titanosaurus, who is being mind-controlled by the mad scientist Dr. Mafune along with his lone daughter Katsura, who are in the midst of rebuilding Mechagodzilla for the black hole aliens, who plan on using both Titanosaurus and the newly rebuilt Mechagodzilla in order to wipe out mankind and rebuild Earth for themselves. Sometime later, Godzilla soon arrives to do battle against the alien invaders. Can the combined forces of the agents from Interpol and Godzilla be enough to stop the evil forces of Dr. Mafune and the black hole aliens from taking over Earth? In terms of what I liked about the movie, if you paid attention to my past few Godzilla movie reviews in which I bring up stock footage, normally I bring it up as a negative aspect, since the movie itself tries to present it as new footage, even though it's footage we've seen before. before. Granted, I understand that some of these movies had a very low budget, so they couldn't necessarily afford to shoot new scenes featuring said monsters, but normally I criticize the usage of stock footage because I think it's very lazy. With this movie, on the other hand, this is one of the few Godzilla movies to actually utilize stock footage in a good way, where there's several points in time where the movie would cut to some stock footage, but when it is used, it's used for flashback sequences. For example, the opening credits of this movie consists nothing but stock footage of Godzilla battling Mechagodzilla throughout the previous movie, with the credits playing over it, which leads nicely into the opening scene of the movie itself. The movie even uses some active stock footage during the final battle where we see Mechagodzilla firing all of its weapons at Godzilla, but the stock footage in terms of how it's presented is different from the previous movie, wherein the final battle of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, we have Mechagodzilla to the right side of the screen firing all of its weapons to the left side of the screen, and all this movie does simply is rotate the image so that Mechagodzilla is now on the left side of the screen firing its weapons to the right. It's a very simple but effective usage of the stock footage, and does make sense within the context of the scene itself. Another aspect to the movie that I liked is how this movie serves as an immediate follow-up to the previous installment, since the Godzilla movies between the original 54 movie up to this point have had a continuity that's been very loosely based, so it is nice and refreshing to see a installment of the Godzilla franchise to serve up as an immediate follow-up to the movie that came before it, having some more consistent continuity. Like, the only other time this has occurred within the Shōwa era of the Godzilla franchise was between movies like Mothra vs. Godzilla up to Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. Granted, there is one scene that does break the continuity within the entire franchise, which I'll talk about later, but I do like the fact that this movie is an immediate follow-up to Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. By continuing the Interpol agency hunting down the alien invaders storyline from the previous movie and having that be the central focus, which I think is a really cool idea for a Godzilla movie like this. I also think that this movie has some really good production values, from the elaborate set designs for the aliens' base of operations, to the small scale miniatures that get destroyed throughout the movie, to even the monster costumes themselves. And keep in mind, the effects themselves were not done by E.G. Tsuburaya, they were instead done by Teruyoshi Nakano, who did the special effects for the previous Godzilla movie. And not only do I think the overall production design for this movie is the best looking of the 1970s era of the Godzilla franchise, but I think this is one of the Godzilla movies to have better production values in general of the Shōwa era of the Godzilla franchise. Another aspect to this movie that I like revolves around the human cast of characters, because between Godzilla vs. Hedorah up to Godzilla vs. Megalon, I found that the majority of the human characters that appeared in those three Godzilla movies were not very interesting to follow, with the exception of maybe 1 to 2 characters. With the human cast of characters that appeared in the previous installment, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, I found a good chunk of those characters to be entertaining to watch, and in some shape or form do matter to the overall story structure of that movie, and definitely had a lot more interesting characters than some of the previous installments that I mentioned before. Although my biggest gripe with that movie was it had one too many characters to keep track of, to a point where I think the movie could have reduced the number of characters to make it more focused. With the cast of human characters that appeared in this movie, it's like a more refined cast of characters that appeared in the previous movie, in that sense where you have a group of human characters that are not only interesting, but do matter to the overall story. But unlike the previous movie where it had a ton of characters to focus on, this movie has a small number to focus on. It uses every single character accordingly, maybe with the exception of 2 characters, which I'll talk about later. But anywho, the cast of characters that appear in this movie are also very well written, to a point that a handful of them, ranging from the likes of Katsura and her father, Dr. Mafune, have gone on to become some of the most memorable characters, not just seen within the context of this movie, but seen within the context of the Godzilla franchise as a whole. And in my opinion, we really haven't had characters that were this interesting since Dr. Daisuke Zerazawa, who appeared in the original 1954 Godzilla movie. And while on the subject of Katsura and her father, Dr. Mafune, I also like the dynamic between these two, since we have a movie in which a pair of characters have a father-daughter relationship, which is something that you don't often see occur within the Godzilla franchise. And the reason as to why these two characters have become so memorable within the context of the Godzilla franchise. Katsura is the daughter of Dr. Mafune, who, through a science experiment gone wrong, gets operated on by the aliens of the movie into becoming the franchise's first human cyborg. And as the movie progresses, we see Katsura struggle with choosing sides, whether or not she wants to help out the main character, Akira Ichinose, in trying to prove to the scientific community that her father wasn't crazy about Titanosaurus, or working with her father and the aliens in hopes to take over the world, essentially becoming a tragic character within the movie. Then you have her father, Dr. Mafune, who in some ways is like a evil version of Dr. Zerazawa, who basically wants to prove to the scientific community that Titanosaurus existed and was made fun of, and essentially aligns himself with the aliens to get back at humanity as a whole. As for the monsters, I don't really have too much to say about either Godzilla or Mechagodzilla, since they are predominantly the same from the previous movie, although Mechagodzilla is slightly different in this movie, which I'll talk about later. But then you have the new addition that takes the form of Titanosaurus, who is the major highlight of the movie for a couple reasons. Reason number one, Titanosaurus has a very cool design, since it looks like a cross between a duck-billed dinosaur, a plesiosaur, and a spinosaurus mixed together that just so happens to be more aquatic in nature, and has various shades of orange and yellow covering his body. Reason number two, Titanosaurus is a lot more down to earth in comparison to some of the newer monsters that Godzilla has fought during the 1970s era of the franchise. For example, you look at some of Godzilla's most recent enemies like Hedorah or Gagan, who are both alien in origin and have various weapons and powers that are very over the top. With Titanosaurus, on the other hand, he is a prehistoric creature that came from Earth who doesn't really have any special weapons or powers to speak of, since he's predominantly a tooth and claw type fighter, although he does have a fishtail-like appendage that does allow him to swim faster or create hurricane gusts of wind when he's on land, making Titanosaurus a nice throwback to other Godzilla monsters like Anguirus or Rodan, in terms of being creatures that have been inspired by prehistoric creatures that rely on tooth and claw type abilities, which I find to be very refreshing. Reason number three, Titanosaurus also has a very unique origin that sort of parallels Katsura in that sense, where Titanosaurus itself is a tragic character, because within the context of the movie, it's established that Titanosaurus is a peaceful dinosaur. However, Titanosaurus soon gets mind-controlled by Dr. Mafune, turning him into a weapon of war. And because of these reasons, I actually think that Titanosaurus is one of the more underrated giant monsters seen within the Godzilla franchise. Granted, I do have one problem with him, which I'll talk about later. And while on the subject of being mind-controlled, although this isn't the first time I've seen a Godzilla movie in which a giant monster is being controlled by someone else, this is the first Godzilla movie in which a giant monster is being mind-controlled by a human. Something that has not been done before within the Godzilla franchise, because normally any Godzilla movie that involves aliens trying to take over Earth, they're the ones that are usually responsible for mind-controlling the monsters to do their evil bidding. So I do find it refreshing that here's the Godzilla movie in which one of the monsters is being mind-controlled by a human. I also like the last third of the movie for two different reasons. The first reason being that we get to see both Titanosaurus and the newly rebuilt Mechagodzilla going on a rampage together, which is always cool to see monsters going on a rampage, but also for the added bonus that we finally get to see Mechagodzilla going on a rampage in a city, since in the previous movie, Mechagodzilla got severely damaged by Godzilla to a point where it had to be called back by the aliens to do repairs on, or if we did see Mechagodzilla going on a rampage, it was usually usually in the countryside or in a factory setting next to the ocean. So it is really cool to see Mechagodzilla going on a full rampage in a city setting. And this also marks the first time that a giant robot has ever gone on a rampage in a Godzilla movie. Now, do I think Titanosaurus and Mechagodzilla's rampage is the best rampage to be seen within the Godzilla franchise up to this point? Personally, I think the rampage sequence in Destroy All Monsters, where we see Godzilla, Mothra, Rodan, and Manda attacking Tokyo together, I think is the best rampage sequence in any Shōwa era Godzilla movie, but I think the rampage between Titanosaurus and Mechagodzilla is a close second. The second reason as to why I like the last third of the movie, the rampage between Titanosaurus and Mechagodzilla leads into the final battle in which Godzilla shows up and battles the two monsters. And the thing that makes the battle with Godzilla battling both Titanosaurus and Mechagodzilla interesting is the fact that the stakes here are raised, because between movies like Godzilla vs. Gigan and Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, Godzilla's always had an ally to accompany him to battle his opponent in some shape or form. This time around, the tables have turned, and Godzilla's fighting two monsters by himself, and he's getting his ass handed to him. Sure, the battle might not be as energetic as the final battle in the previous installment, but I still thought it was a good battle nonetheless. Although sometime near the end of the battle, when you do see Godzilla having a rematch with his mechanical doppelganger, there is a point in time where the pyrotechnics from the various explosions caused by Mechagodzilla's arsenal does indeed light the Godzilla suit on fire, which is something that doesn't happen very often. Although when it does happen, give the suit actors props for actually going through with the stunt, considering how dangerous that is. And that just shows how dedicated the suit actors are to their craft of playing these characters. Another aspect to this movie that I liked is the brand new ability that Mechagodzilla has in this movie, because in the previous movie, when Godzilla defeats Mechagodzilla, Godzilla manages to defeat his robotic doppelganger by pulling its head off its body, resulting in the destruction of the robot. In this movie, it looks like they're going to do the same thing, where Godzilla does grab Mechagodzilla by the head and then proceeds to pull it off, but several moments later, it's revealed that Mechagodzilla has a backup head, allowing it to still function without the regular head, which I think is really cool that the filmmakers decided to pull a bait and switch on the audience by allowing Mechagodzilla to function without its regular head. Also, to add on top of that, this shows continuity consistency with the previous movie in that sense, where the aliens learned their mistake from the previous movie by allowing Mechagodzilla to have a backup head in case if the giant robot ever were to lose its head again, serving as a nice continuity nod with the previous movie. As for the next aspect of the movie, I have mixed feelings towards the green screen effects, because there are some green screen effect shots that look great, but then there are some green screen shots that look bad. For example, some of the green screen composite shots that I think look good is the one point in time where we have a wide shot of Mechagodzilla's feet on top of a base, and at the very bottom of the base we see a bunch of aliens along with some human prisoners walking around the base of Mechagodzilla's feet, and the composite between the footage revolved around the alien human characters and the footage of Mechagodzilla's feet I think are composited very well to a point that it looks believable. Then there are some composite shots that are very ambitious but don't work very well. Like, the example that comes to mind is the scene where we have one of the aliens entering Mechagodzilla's head, and the way the entire composite shot is pulled off, you have a extreme close-up of Mechagodzilla's head from the side point of view, and there's a door that's clearly composited that allows the alien to enter. And the thing is, I think the idea behind it is very cool, it's just the effect itself doesn't work very well. As for the next aspect of the movie, it's something that I didn't necessarily like, but I didn't hate it either. If anything, it just caught me by surprise, that being some partial nudity that's shown in the Japanese cut of the movie, because there are several points in time where we see Katsura being operated on by the aliens, and there's this one point in time where we see her breasts for a good 20 to 30 seconds. Now sure, Godzilla vs. Megalon technically did feature some female nudity, but it's one of those things where if you blink, you miss it kind of deal, because it's just a background element. Now, with this movie, on the other hand, when we do see Katsura topless during her operation, we do indeed see her breasts, but the context in which we see them makes actual sense to the plot, since her being operated on by the aliens is an important plot point for later in the movie. It's just one of those things where seeing nudity in a Godzilla movie in general is just very surreal to think about, since that's something that you wouldn't necessarily expect in a Godzilla movie. Another aspect to this movie that I have mixed feelings towards is one of tone, since Terror of Mechagodzilla, out of the 1970s era of the Shōwa Godzilla movies, is by far the darkest installment, which I find to be very refreshing since the previous 4 installments were very goofy and over the top. And here's my problem with it. Ishirō Honda tried to bring the franchise back to its roots by making this movie as dark and bleak as the original 1954 movie, but the movie is also plagued with some really goofy moments that could only exist in a 1970s era Godzilla movie that feel really out of place for what the movie's trying to go for. Now sure, other Godzilla movies like Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster and the previous installment, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, have had a nice balance of having more serious moments mixed with some cartoony moments, but there was a nice balance to it. With this movie, it is predominantly very serious, and once in a great while, it does have these cartoony moments that feel really out of place. It doesn't really complement the more serious moments. So now we're stuck with a movie that's totally trying to be like an early 1960s Godzilla movie, but has a ton of goofy moments and tropes that could only occur in a 1970s Godzilla movie, and the two don't mix very well. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, in my previous review, there was a gigantic plot hole that occurs within the story that I wanted to talk about, but because my review went on longer than I intended it to, I decided to bring up that plot hole here because the exact same plot hole also occurs in this movie. That plot hole being the aliens require a human scientist to help them rebuild or repair Mechagodzilla, which makes no sense considering the fact that Mechagodzilla is a weapon of mass destruction created by the aliens. So you would think that the aliens who created Mechagodzilla would be able to do repairs and rebuild Mechagodzilla without any problems. But for some reason, the aliens required the assistance of a human scientist to do repairs on Mechagodzilla. Another problem that I have with the movie is the editing to certain scenes, because depending on what the scene is, I found the editing to be rather sporadic. For example, there's a point in time where we have our main character talking to Katsura, and the scene cuts back and forth between our two lead characters and this old man who's really a henchman for the aliens. And when we do cut back to the old man, we only focus on him for a split second, and then it just immediately cuts back to the two lead characters. Now, I get what the scene is trying to do, it just feels like it wasn't focused enough, where maybe anytime we cut back to the old man, I think that we should focus on the old man for a couple more seconds to justify cutting back and forth between him and the two lead characters. As the scene sits, I could have done without seeing clips of the old man henchman. And speaking of which, another problem that I have with the movie revolves around the old man henchman who serves the aliens. Because for the first 2/3 of the movie, he's shown to be a reoccurring character, but during Titanosaurus' night rampage, he disappears, not to be seen again for the remainder of the movie. Another problem that I have with the movie is focus, because the movie is called Terror of Mechagodzilla, but the movie's not really about Mechagodzilla. It's more about Titanosaurus than it is about Mechagodzilla. Now sure, Mechagodzilla does appear throughout the entire movie, but here's the thing. For the first 2/3 of the movie, it's being rebuilt, and during those first 2/3, it's predominantly a background element, because Titanosaurus is the main focus for the first 2/3 of the movie. And when Mechagodzilla does activate during the last third of the movie, it does take part in the final battle, but once Godzilla shows up, Mechagodzilla predominantly stays in the background, allowing Titanosaurus to do all the work. And once in a great while, we do see Mechagodzilla fire a couple missiles and laser beams at Godzilla, but then it just goes back to Titanosaurus battling Godzilla all over again. And while on the topic of Mechagodzilla, another problem that I have with Mechagodzilla as a whole, despite this version of Mechagodzilla being a upgrade from the previous movie, it feels more like a downgrade of anything else. Because in the previous movie, Mechagodzilla was a force to be reckoned with. Doesn't matter if it was fighting its opponent using long-range weapons or fighting hand-to-hand, it kicked everyone's ass and made Godzilla bleed on multiple occasions. With the Mechagodzilla that appears in this movie, on the other hand, it's the exact opposite, where Mechagodzilla is depicted more as a glass cannon than a brutal war machine that he was in the previous movie. In that sense where Mechagodzilla has extremely powerful weapons to use for long-range combat, but once Godzilla begins to fight Mechagodzilla in close-range combat, Godzilla makes pretty short work of it. And speaking of Godzilla, another problem that I have with the movie is when Godzilla shows up. Because on one hand, although this movie is called Terror of Mechagodzilla, it's still an installment of the Godzilla franchise. And Godzilla himself doesn't physically appear until the 55-minute mark of the movie. That's only 80 minutes in length. And when Godzilla does appear in the movie, I sometimes forget he's even in the movie at all, since you never really feel his presence within the first 2/3 of the movie, due to the fact that this entire movie is more focused on Titanosaurus than Godzilla. Another problem that I have with the movie revolves around this one scene where you have Katsura talking to her father about unleashing Titanosaurus. And there's this line of dialogue that single-handedly destroys any continuity that occurred throughout the entire Shōwa era of the Godzilla franchise. The lines of dialogue that Katsura says goes something like this. Surely you don't mean to release the disaster monsters again like King Ghidorah, Mighty Rodan, and Terrible Amanda. And the single biggest problem that I have with this one line of dialogue is that it implies Dr. Mafune was the one that was responsible for mind controlling King Ghidorah and Rodan in past movies, even though those monsters were mind controlled by alien races like the Exilians and the Kilaaks, destroying any consistency within the Shōwa era of the Godzilla franchise. And keep in mind, the continuity during the Shōwa era already didn't make a whole lot of sense to begin with. Another problem that I have with the movie occurs near the beginning, where you have a group of Interpol agents listening to a recording of some of their other agents on a submarine screaming in terror, and moments later you hear Titanosaurus. And their primary reaction to this recording goes something like this. I can't believe what I'm hearing. Did they really say a dinosaur? Which makes absolutely no sense, considering the fact that Godzilla exists in this universe along with a handful of other prehistoric monsters. So listening to a recording of a bunch of people screaming about a dinosaur attacking their submarine should be like, were they attacked by Godzilla? No, this doesn't sound like Godzilla. This sounds like something else. But instead, they act surprised by what they heard, despite the fact that, like I said a few moments ago, Godzilla and other giant monsters exist in this universe. Also, within the exact same scene, before they even begin to listen to the recording, a lot of the Interpol agents are discussing about the destruction of the submarine that was destroyed by Titanosaurus at the very beginning of the movie. And some of the characters are talking about how it was destroyed. You got one character that states, did it explode? And one of the other characters goes, no, it was completely crushed. Which is bullshit, because when you do see Titanosaurus destroying the submarine, it clearly explodes. Also, before I go any further, remember how at the beginning of this review I stated that this was one of the few Godzilla movies that I remember renting as a kid? Well, when I did rent this movie, it was on VHS in a English dub, and when the movie did begin, it opened up with nothing but stock footage of Godzilla battling Mechagodzilla, with the opening credits playing over the stock footage. Now, fast forward several years later when I decided to buy this movie on DVD and watch the English dub for this review, the beginning of the English dub on the DVD is drastically different than what I was used to seeing, because the way the English dub of this movie opens up, it has a 6-minute prologue that consists of nothing but stock footage from several other Godzilla movies with a narration basically summing up the entire Shōwa era in a nutshell. And after that 6-minute mark, the English movie actually begins with the actual opening credits with stock footage of the previous Godzilla movie in which we see Godzilla battling Mechagodzilla as the credits play over said stock footage. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm not entirely sure as to why there was a 6-minute prologue attached to the English dub for the DVD release. Like, I could have done without this 6-minute prologue, because not only is it unnecessary to the entire movie, but the actual film quality to the stock footage looks terrible in contrasting with the rest of the movie, because when the actual movie begins, the film quality looks fantastic, yet the quality of the stock footage looks terrible in comparison. And for my last problem with the movie, which in the grand scheme of things is more of a nitpick, that being, I wish Agent Nambara from the previous movie came back for this movie, not only because this movie's more focused on the Interpol agency as a whole, but Nambara was one of the coolest characters from the previous movie, and having a Godzilla movie that features the Interpol agency without featuring Special Agent Nambara feels like a wasted opportunity. So, for my final verdict of the movie, Terror of Mechagodzilla, objectively speaking, is the best made Godzilla movie to come out of the 1970s era of the Shōwa Godzilla series. That being said, I still think the previous installment is a lot better than this installment, because with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, that movie was literally a live-action Saturday morning cartoon in the best way possible, and as far as I'm concerned, is the one Godzilla movie to represent the 70s era of the Godzilla franchise the best. With this movie, on the other hand, Terror of Mechagodzilla is basically the 1970s equivalent of Ghidorah the three-headed monster, in that sense where the human aspect of the story is a lot more sophisticated than your average Godzilla movie, but the monster action is very cartoony in contrast. But my biggest gripe with this movie has to do with focus, because the movie is called Terror of Mechagodzilla, yet it's not really about Mechagodzilla, it's more about Titanosaurus if anything else. And unlike Ghidorah the three-headed monster, I feel that this movie doesn't quite know how to balance out the darker aspects of the human story with the more cartoonish aspects of the monster action, resulting in a movie that's basically become the black sheep of the 1970s era of the Godzilla franchise. So overall, I do think that Terror of Mechagodzilla is a pretty good movie that is worth watching, but I think the movie should have been called Terror of Titanosaurus. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Terror of Mechagodzilla? Looks like the movie got pretty average reception, which again I find to be surprising. And so, for my final rating of Terror of Mechagodzilla, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. So, with this movie serving as the final installment of the Shōwa era of the Godzilla franchise, do you think this was a good way to end this continuity of Godzilla movies? And see you later.